Recently, I was doing some research on a book called The Place Called Dagon, which was originally published in 1927. What interested me about The Place Called Dagon is that it revolves around an insular rural town, and in this town, hiding behind closed doors, there's a sinister cult practicing witchcraft. And as if this wasn't bad enough, this sinister cult is planning to conduct a human sacrifice in honor of their dark gods to bring prosperity to their impoverished rural town. If you think this plot sounds familiar, then you'd be right. This has pretty much become a ubiquitous plot in horror films these days. Think of films like The Wicker Man, or more recently, Midsummer, and you'll be on the right track. One of my favorite examples of this is the Edgar Wright film, Hot Fuzz.
Oh, come, Sergeant.
You should be ashamed. Calling yourself a community that cares.
Oh, but we do care, Nicholas.
It's all about the greater good.
The greater good.
How can this be for the greater good?
The greater good.
This story trope, which I would like to call the town with a secret cult, is a huge part of a particular subgenre of horror fiction and films called folk horror. While there's no concrete definition of the subgenre, folk horror often involves rural settings where the horror elements come from pagan religions, witchcraft, or elements of folklore. In films in particular, the typical folk horror story is about a rural village, where behind the charade of everyday village life lurks a dark secret. It's often a sinister cult which demands a human sacrifice, usually for the purpose of bringing prosperity to a rural community. But what interested me is that I thought that this was a relatively recent literary trope. Except The Place Called Dagon has this trope in it, and that was published all the way back in 1927. So how old is the trope of the town with a secret cult, and where did it come from? I decided to take a look at the first stories which contained this trope, and came up with some pretty interesting results. At the start of The Place Called Dagon, there is an introduction, written by a man named Larry Creasy, who's an expert on Herbert S. Gorman's work. And this introduction gives a bit of history about Gorman's work and also his inspirations for the novel. In the introduction, Creasy lists Nathaniel Hawthorne as being a big inspiration for Gorman. In particular, a short story by Hawthorne called Young Goodman Brown, which was published in 1835. In Hawthorne's story, Young Goodman Brown, the titular character ventures into the nearby forest at night on an errand, and while in the forest, the young man stumbles upon a black mass being observed by the entire population of the town which he lives in. The story is essentially an allegory about Christian faith, and so it isn't written in the style of a mystery, like the trope of the town with a secret cult usually is. But this story does contain a lot of the essential elements of the trope. There's a rural town, wherein there's a secret witch cult not known about even to some of the inhabitants of the town. It's easy to see how Gorman might have extrapolated on the plot of Young Goodman Brown to come up with a more mystery-based thriller plot for his book, The Place Called Dagon. And there are good reasons to suspect that this is probably the case. Herbert S. Gorman actually wrote a biography of Nathaniel Hawthorne, so Gorman would have been very familiar not only with Hawthorne's work, but also with his family history, which is an interesting clue as to where Hawthorne might have gotten his idea for Young Goodman Brown. Nathaniel Hawthorne was a native of the town of Salem, a town infamously known to most of the world for the witch trials that were held there. One of Nathaniel Hawthorne's ancestors, John Hawthorne, was actually one of the judges who presided over the witch trials in Salem. So we can see that Hawthorne was probably drawing on history for the plot of Young Goodman Brown. While Young Goodman Brown does have many of the common motifs of folk horror, such as a secret cult in a small rural town, it also doesn't share many of the ideas of other folk horror stories, such as the European setting, the theme of the modern way of life versus the ancient way of life, and, of course, human sacrifice. Young Goodman Brown was the earliest example of the folk horror trope of the town with a secret cult that I could find, but I still wasn't entirely satisfied with Young Goodman Brown as being the original source of this folk horror trope. More importantly, the witches and heathens in Young Goodman Brown and The Place Called Dagon seem to draw very much from Puritan values and exist within the Christian worldview, while the dreaded heathens in The Wicker Man and other examples of folk horror have their own alternative worldview and gods. A quote from young Goodman Brown demonstrates this. "My faith is gone," he cried, after one stupefied moment. "There is no good on earth, and sin is but a name. Come, devil, for thee is the world given." In young Goodman Brown, the horror comes from the idea that Christians have turned away from God and are worshipping the devil, which is not surprising since the inspiration for the story is probably the witch trials at Salem. The witches in young Goodman Brown are essentially anti-Christians, and please note that I'm using the term anti-Christians very loosely here. What I mean when I say anti-Christians is that in the Puritan value system, a person must work hard in this life and forego pleasure to receive everlasting joy in the afterlife. But the witches in folklore invert this system. They trade their eternal souls for immediate pleasure, and that is the extent of the magic and religion in young Goodman Brown.
Wouldst thou like the taste of butter, a pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
Yes.
In the more European type of folk horror, such as The Wicker Man, the themes of religion extend beyond the Christian worldview. They have completely denounced the Christian god as either being non-existent or as being less powerful than other gods, such as in The Wicker Man, where the villagers decide that the Christian god can't bring them a rich harvest, and instead Lord Summerisle offers them an alternative religion which can deliver these results.
In the last century, the islanders were starving. Like our neighbors today, they were scratching a bare subsistence from sheep and sea. Then in 1868, my grandfather bought this barren island and began to change things.
Best way of accomplishing this, so it seemed to him, was to rouse the people from their apathy by giving them back their joyous old gods.
And that as a result of this worship, the barren island would burgeon and bring forth fruit in great abundance.
He brought me out the same way, to reverence the music and the drama and the rituals of the old gods, to love nature and to fear it, and to rely on it and to appease it where necessary. He brought me up.
He brought you up to be a pagan.
So the main themes of the most famous example of folk horror, The Wicker Man, don't really fit with the origin of Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Salem witch trials, or even with European witch trials, which are limited to being mainly concerned with a Christian worldview. I have to say though, there are other examples of American folk horror, stories such as The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, which involve human sacrifice in exchange for a good harvest. But regardless, this only points to another source of this inspiration. The fact that Shirley Jackson, of all people, drew on this idea is a really big clue, and I'll come back to that later. But I didn't want to stop there. I wanted to find out other possible sources for folk horror, and particularly I wanted to find out where the idea of alternative religions to Christianity came into the picture. And usually the best place to start when you want to find the source of a literary trope is to start with the most famous example of it and work backwards. In this case, I think the most famous example is the Wicker Man film from 1973. The Wicker Man was based on a book called Ritual by David Pinner, published in 1967. When I looked up interviews with David Pinner, Pinner had this to say about his inspiration. "I was interested in witchcraft and Denis Wheatley's books, and that combination resulted in Ritual." Denis Wheatley was an early 20th century author who wrote a prodigious amount of adventure and thriller novels, but most importantly for us is that a few of his books dealt with the occult and Satanism, things which, despite him being a devout Christian, he was a bit of an expert on. One of his most famous novels in particular is called The Devil Rides Out, and it's about a cult of devil worshippers led by a charismatic figure. The presence of a charismatic leader is an important aspect of the trope of a town with a secret cult, and we can see the origin of that here. But this is where the trail went dead. The Devil Rides Out was published in 1934, and we already know that The Place Called Dagon was published in 1927 and already had the trope of a town with a secret cult in it, and also had the trope of a charismatic leader in it. In fact, while David Pinner cites Denis Wheatley as a source of inspiration for Ritual, and therefore The Wicker Man, The Devil Rides Out doesn't really have many of the tropes of folk horror in it, and for that matter, neither does Ritual. I actually read Ritual as part of the research for this video, and I was quite surprised what the book was actually like. It's really a bizarre fever dream of a book, and while it definitely does have a lot of the aspects of folk horror, its plot is not as clearly defined and typical as later entries into the folk horror genre are. What Ritual does have is the thematic opposition between Christianity and other religions. The protagonist in Ritual is, like in The Wicker Man, a puritanical Christian police officer who expresses outrage and disgust at the irreligiosity of the villagers and their occult practices. So we see here a seed of the juxtaposition between the old and new religion that would become a staple of folk horror in works like The Wicker Man. But I was at a loss, so I wanted to go back to the drawing board. It seems to me like this idea of the town with a secret cult maybe just sprang out of the cultural zeitgeist. After all, a town with a mystery is not exactly that difficult to come up with, so maybe there wasn't really an original source for this idea. The witches in The Place Called Dagon are descendants from Salem, a town, as we have already discussed, notable for its witch trials, which, at the time, people believed exposed a secret cult of witches in the town. So perhaps that really is the source of the trope of the town with a secret cult. It certainly inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herbert S. Gorman, and those are the two earliest examples of this particular trope that I could find. But it also seems that folk horror isn't really an American genre. The modern country of America as we know it is, after all, a colony, and its history only goes back a few hundred years. And before that, the continent of North America was occupied by Native Americans, and Native American culture doesn't tend to be a big staple of folk horror, although it certainly plays a part. So the idea of a sinister ancient cult worshipping old gods, like the old gods that are mentioned in The Place Called Dagon, doesn't seem to fit this setting, because they clearly have pagan inspirations. On top of that, The Wicker Man and The Devil Rides Out are very British, and it's pretty unlikely that these works would have been drawing on American history, like the Salem witch trials. Of course, there were witch trials in Europe a lot earlier than America, but I still think this doesn't quite fit. So I kept searching. Since all this research began with a book that inspired the famous horror author H.P. Lovecraft, I decided to go and see whether H.P. Lovecraft had anything to say on the matter. Lovecraft actually wrote an essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature, which was all about the supernatural horror genre, and this essay had a selection of Lovecraft's thoughts about the genre. Maybe that would help me in unraveling the mystery. The essay was written in the mid-1920s and then added to into the early 1930s, so it's a valuable resource of the history of supernatural horror from the perspective of somebody in the 1920s. In the essay, there's a section called The Dawn of the Horror Tale, and in that section, Lovecraft writes this: "Much of the power of Western horror lore was undoubtedly due to the hidden but often suspected presence of a hidden cult of nocturnal worshippers, whose strange customs were stealthily handed down amongst peasants for thousands of years, despite the outward reign of the Druidic, Greco-Roman, and Christian faiths in the regions involved. The Salem affair forms the chief American example." So this is really fascinating. Lovecraft seems to be very familiar with this trope already in the 1920s. And not only that, but Lovecraft also identifies Salem as a source for this, and points to the idea that these secret cults could be handed down for thousands of years. So Lovecraft is identifying two sources for this kind of story. First, in the American context, Salem seems to form a lot of the inspiration for this kind of story, and we've already explored this and found it to be a bit of a dead end. But Lovecraft also identifies that in other regions, different folklore and history might be responsible. While I was looking at Lovecraft's essay, I recalled Lovecraft mentioning a book called The Witch Cult in Western Europe by a Miss Murray in a few of his stories, like The Call of Cthulhu. So I decided to check out this book and see what I could find. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The Witch Cult in Western Europe is a book written by Margaret Murray, who was an anthropologist in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This book was published in 1921 and presents a really interesting hypothesis, commonly referred to as the witch cult hypothesis. To quote the book itself, the hypothesis is roughly this. Underlying the Christian religion was a cult practiced by many classes of the community, chiefly, however, by the more ignorant or those in the less thickly inhabited parts of the country. It can be traced back to pre-Christian times and appears to be the ancient religion of Western Europe. Basically, Murray was arguing that there was originally an ancient pre-Christian religion in Western Europe, and when Christianity was spreading throughout Europe, a lot of people publicly adopted Christianity, but secretly still practiced their original religion behind closed doors, especially in more remote areas where church organizations held less sway. Now that sounds more like it. We have all the elements of folk horror, an ancient sinister religion, and remote villages, and it's European-centric. So this is starting to look a little bit more like the inspiration for the trope of a town with a secret cult. In addition to this, Margaret Murray was proposing that the witch cult was worshipping the horned god, a deity which was being mistakenly conflated with the Christian devil, but was in fact a completely different pagan deity. The Witch Cult in Western Europe is a pretty obscure book these days, and Margaret Murray's theory was reaching a bit too far and tended to generalize too much. The witch cult hypothesis was increasingly criticized in the 1960s and early 1970s, which is why the book isn't well known today. In fact, I would have never found out about it if not for Lovecraft's references to it in The Call of Cthulhu. Regardless of its present obscurity, the witch cult in Western Europe received a fair bit of attention in academic circles at the time it was published, enough at least that Lovecraft came into contact with it. But also interesting is that the witch cult hypothesis was being criticized by academics in the 1960s and 70s, about the same time that David Pinner was writing Ritual. So all this stuff about witch cults was definitely in the air at the time, and David Pinner said that he was interested in witchcraft, so maybe Murray's novel was a bit of an inspiration for him. There are a few clues that this might have been the case. Early on in David Pinner's novel Ritual, a priest refers to witchcraft as the, quote, old religion. The term old religion in reference to a witch cult is something that Margaret Murray popularized. So it seems that David Pinner is using the same terminology that Murray used. It's not definite proof, since this might have been common terminology used in anthropology surrounding witchcraft, but it's a clue, and since it's in the early part of the novel, it's low-hanging fruit when it comes to illusions of literary inspiration. In addition, The Lottery by Shirley Jackson is another piece of literature, and although Jackson was American, it shares the same human sacrifice to bring a bountiful harvest trope. I've done a previous video specifically about Shirley Jackson and witchcraft, so I happen to know that as a young woman, Jackson was obsessed with the idea of witchcraft and even wrote a book about the witch trials at Salem. More importantly, she was also reading anthropological texts about witchcraft. I think it's fairly likely that Jackson may have come into contact with the witch cult in Western Europe at some point, and even if she didn't, she was reading other anthropological texts about witchcraft. So it's easy to see how she could have come to the idea of a small town with a hidden cult practicing human sacrifice. Anyway, I feel that the witch cult in Western Europe is kind of like a missing piece of the puzzle when it comes to the origin of the remote village with a secret cult trope, because it contains the seed of a major horror trope, a religion which is practiced in secret in remote rural places. I'm not saying that it's the holy grail that explains the entire origin of folk horror, but we can see where the ideas about paganism and secret religions were starting to come into the societal consciousness and into horror literature. I hope that this bit of research fascinated you just as much as it did me. I always love tracing back the ideas in novels and seeing how they develop. If you'd like to see more videos like this, then subscribe because I'll definitely be making more. Thanks for watching.